from Quite the Thing Media.
Hello, listeners. This is Ariel Nissenblatt from Earbuds Podcast Collective and Squadcast.fm. Thank you for joining Jeff, aka Podcast Father, on this journey, sharing great things content creators are doing. He's the indie podcaster.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artists? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the Podcast Father.
Welcome to another episode of Indie Podcaster. Clearly, I'm not Jeff. I've abducted him. I'm taking over the show for the day. I'm Leah from She Will Rock You. And I'm just kidding. Jeff is here too.
Oh, I'm here. Jeff, a.k.a. Podcast Father. I threw her in the spot there and made her start the intro. I threw her off for a second, but you did a hell of a job. Thanks for having me on your podcast, Leah.
I'm the captain now.
I like that. Sometimes the captain it can be a struggle. It can be a grind, you know?
It can be the grind, but we do it because we love the podcasting community.
Leah and Beth Ann have an awesome podcast called She Will Rock You Podcast. We've been talking about it in the introductions the last couple episodes, so I hope you're taking the time to check it out. If not, you should probably get on that crap because it's great.
Please listen to us. Please.
You have to give us a chance.
We'll beg you. It
is a good podcast, though. I love it, and I think everybody should check it out. But today we are here for a different reason. We are going to share a conversation that I had with Bryan Barletta, not to be confused with Ryan Cabrera.
I hope he has a better hairstyle than Ryan did in those famous Ashley Simpson photos.
I think Ryan's, he's shaving the head now, I think.
That's a better hairstyle.
I'm sorry, Bryan, if you aren't, man. I apologize. But no, seriously, I got to chat with Bryan. He's a really cool guy. You get to look into him some, Leah?
Yeah, he is. I feel like I need to pick his brain now because he seems like an advertising mastermind. And we do not do much advertising on our show.
Oh, come on now. You retweet on Twitter. That's all everybody needs. A retweet. I need my damn retweet.
Hashtag follow Friday.
Yeah, follow Friday. I love it. Bryan is a go-to guy. He's involved with Pod News, and he spins off into his own newsletter, Sounds Profitable Newsletter. This is a great newsletter. I mean, I'd recommend it to anybody, but especially if you're a content creator and you want to learn more about advertising, ad tech, it's going to help you to learn more about this stuff. And Bryan has just a hell of a lot of knowledge in it. This is an awesome conversation.
Can't wait to hear it.
Just another one that's a great resource for the podcasting community. And I'm just thankful that I get to meet and interact with cool people like him and like you, Leah. Don't get me wrong.
Thanks. I'm cool.
You are cool. Too cool for school, but let's not be too cool. We need to get into this interview. Before I do that, I'm going to take care of a little business. You go ahead. You say it too.
Business.
This podcast lives on engagement from you listeners. I absolutely love all of you. And if you aren't already, please do contact me. You can do that on Twitter at podcast_father or by email thepodcastfather@gmail.com. Also have a little contact section on my website, podcastfather.com. If you'd be so kind to, you can leave a review on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast platform you listen to your podcast on. This podcast and myself are proud members of Quite the Thing Media. Quite the Thing Media, a community-based podcast network full of all independent content creators. Podcasts that speak to you, so make sure you check it out, quitethethingmedia.com. All the music on this podcast is credited to the independent artist Young Cart. So check it out, youngcartbeats.com. We've got some amazing sponsors on this podcast, and one of them is Podpage, the perfect place to make your podcast website. All of the link trees are great and all, but it doesn't really get you that CEO that you need, that digital trail that's also critical when you're a content creator. What do you want people to find when they search your podcast? It's very important to have an actual real podcast website, and the WordPresses are so difficult to set up and use. No. Podpage is the way to go. Tons of integrations make this a super easy process. So many different great features. You could range from packages for free clear up to the ones with all the gifts and gadgets that are incredible. But regardless, this is a simple way to make your podcast website. I'll tell you what, you go on podpage.com right now, you use the promo code FATHER in all caps, you get $20 off the package of your choice. Podpage.com. Indie Drop-In is a fantastic thing and a great sponsor of this podcast. Are you a podcaster that has a true crime, paranormal, scary, or even a comedy podcast, and you want to drop it in a legitimate feed and gain new listenership? Man, I tell you what, Indie Drop-In is a great resource for that. You can be featured in an episode. Your product can go out on an established podcast feed with established listeners already. Make sure you get online on indiedropin.com/creators and check it out. All right, now that fun is all over, let's jump into this interview and have a hell of a good time doing it. I'm speaking with Bryan Barletta today. He's involved in all sorts of great things. Thanks for giving me a chat today, Bryan. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Bryan Barletta. I run soundsprofitable.com, which is part of the Pod News Network. And my entire focus is on making podcast advertising and ad tech as accessible as possible to everybody in the space, because we're at a really fortunate time where the technology is actually really easy to use if you just turn off your emails, cancel some meetings for about a day or two. And the tools that people like Wondery and NPR use are the same tools that are available to any podcaster who wants to sign up for an account on basically any platform. So my entire goal is to make that available and explain that to as many people as will listen, I guess.
You do this with your newsletter and podcast form.
Yeah, so I figured that the best way to show off some of the examples and really test all the features I talk about, dynamic ad insertion, ad rotation, tracking, like lift reports, surveys, everything that you can think of. The best way to do that would be to have my own podcast, which is a testing ground. And my goal always is the content of the podcast is valuable, but people know that they're also going to hear some cool execution. So newsletter started September 2020, and the podcast started January 2021. We took off a month for the podcast of September, but we back off on this Sunday. Will be the first episode back with our new format. And so every week there's the newsletter, a podcast episode. I do a narrated version of the podcast or the newsletter in podcast form. And then in October, we're going to have a Spanish version of the podcast and a Spanish version of the newsletter, the same format, right? The narrated one, so that we can reach a broader audience.
I try to promote the newsletter every week. I love it.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
This will be a great conversation for the listeners of this podcast. Obviously, quite a few of them are content creators. So I look forward to giving them some valuable information with you here today, Bryan. Let's start at the beginning. Walk us through how you kind of developed an interest in technology and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I was obsessed with cell phones. Like, I remember being 14 and working at McDonald's and spending all my money to buy a Nokia, one of those brick phones. And then I would buy whatever ridiculous unsubsidized phone that was out there. And then the smartphones came and the iPhone came and I became obsessed with it. And I wrote about apps and reviewed apps. And then I fell into advertising because it felt like I couldn't develop an app and I wasn't really confident in the content I was putting out, but I knew that there was these smart people out there building this stuff and advertising helped them get more money to keep doing it. So I fell into ad tech. I fell right into mobile ad tech, I guess about 13 years now, and have been doing product management to sales engineering, moved from Massachusetts to New York for it. And then about 6 years ago, I moved down to Texas. And that's about when I started in the podcast space. I was one of the founding members of Barometric, which was acquired by Claritas, which is one of the top 3 attribution partners out there in podcasting to see success in a campaign. And so as a founding member there, I was at Megaphone for a little under a year as a senior product manager of data and monetization. So really building out the ad server, the data pipelines, and making sure the sales team were set up for success to sell it. And so ad tech has been my life, my whole career. I wanted to be a history teacher, fell out of that fast. But for fun, I mean, I'm a dad of 2. My youngest is 2 months. My oldest is 3 years old. My wife just texted me that he got pushed at the playground. So interested to hear about that story afterwards. I have a beautiful wife, Sierra, and loving dog, Tonks. And my newest hobby is buying video games and never having time to play them.
Sounds like parenthood.
Right? I think by the time they're in school, I'll go back and revisit all these games and definitely not just forget about them and buy new ones.
You forgot to mention you like long walks on the beach.
Well, now that it's getting a little cooler here in Texas, 100%.
Some of the listeners may not know what ad tech is. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, I like to be as all-encompassing as possible because I think that we kind of trivialize ad tech and people think about it as just like the serving of ads. But I think of ad tech as anything in a technical focus or analytical focus that can lead to revenue generation. And specifically, podcast ad tech is in the podcast space. So your download numbers and how that's calculated through your hosting platform, that's ad tech, right? Because you need that to represent the size of your show, right? The ads serving themselves is an easy one. But how do you target? How do you track attribution, right? Someone heard the ad and then they went to the website to purchase it. How do you match those to figure out if it was successful or not? Even subscriptions, I consider part of ad tech because it's still a flow. You don't just put subscriptions up there and hope people click it. You still advertise to them about it. So basically, it's, I guess, ad tech is the technical side and the analytical side of monetization in a field.
Couldn't have broke it down any better myself, man. So let's take a second here and have you explain to us about the newsletter, how it got started. It actually is tied to Pod News. Can you walk us through and explain that to us?
Yeah, when I left Megaphone, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. There was a lot of opportunity, but I felt like I kept butting my head at every job I've ever had about talking about how the truths of how things really work. And when you're inside of a company, you kind of hit a point where you realize that the company is selling their version of the truth. It's not always wrong, but it's not as unbiased as it could be. And that had been my experience in my whole career. And I was just tired of fighting with people about it. So I started writing about this is exactly how it works, or this is what we should do. And I had met James at Podcast Movement in March earlier that year, right before the world ended. Or I guess it was February. Was it February? And it was so great to meet him. We talked, we really hit it off. We talked about standards and tech and everything. And so when I wrote my first 2 articles on Medium, James immediately shared them and very supportive. And so I reached out and I said, hey, Pod News is doing really well, but I'd love to talk to the people directly in the industry, right? The major companies where people are just not getting educated well enough. I think it's really tough. The people who are managers and VPs and directors right now weren't trained to be managers, VPs, and directors. They were just really successful at what they did and they were promoted up. So they're struggling now to meet the expectations of their bosses while also fostering that next generation of people. And that next generation of people are being excluded from meetings and learnings, especially with things remote, because people just don't think to invite them into it. And I consistently was not invited into places where, my boss would come out and be like, hey, we just signed up for this new product. It's all yours to figure out. And I'd be so heartbroken because I was like, oh, I like their competitor better. I wish I could have had a say in this or asked them some tough questions. So I asked James, I said, is there room for another newsletter? Can we make it the Pod News Network? And he was so generous about that. He took a huge chance on me. And I'm very, very happy. We just ended 1 year working together on this, and our plans are to continue it and grow Pod News as much as possible, because I think it is the center point of it, right? It is the ideal objective journalism in the space. And then there's room for some deep industry focused thoughts, right? Hot Pod is fantastic. Ashley Carmen has been so great with The Verge. And I actually just paid for the year-long subscription for Hot Pod, something I've never done before because I love her writing. But it reads a little bit different, right? It's got a mainstream appeal. And what me and James are trying to do is equip this industry to better themselves and to better each other.
I'm definitely a big fan of Pod News and a big fan of your work, Bryan. It's amazing all the connections you've made over the years. You kind of rose through the ranks. How did this all start out, and what's that battle like?
I'd love to tell you that it was a big struggle. The best thing I did was I just worked for smart companies with great reputations, and I had the opportunity to solve problems for people who had been struggling to solve them, right? And so you just make connections. It's when you become indispensable at a company and they want to bring you places. Like I went to Podcast Movement, it was me, the CRO, and the COO, the CRO and the CFO. Like I was one of 3 people at a 100-person company that got to go there, because I could back up the CRO on a technical side when he got on stage and I could answer the more advanced questions. And you focus on just solving people's problems. I think the biggest thing that I can say for people in the B2B space or people in the podcasting space is just focus that. I will talk to everybody, right? I love talking to people and figuring out how I can help them, how I can collaborate with them. I don't try and sell, sponsorship or the consulting or anything like that. My goal is like, who can I connect you with, right? How do I pay that forward? How do I do that? And the only way that I got here was for a lot of people, I just latched on and I said, you are doing cool things. I want to support you further. I want to be in every conversation you're in where I can help. I can back you up. And for the people that are looking to do that, I really recommend it. Work in the field that you want to expand on. Meet the people without asking for anything, and then build something and just ask them to be part of it, not to do anything for you.
I call that strategic bulldogging, Bryan. But never, all seriousness, the self-employed thing can be a struggle as far as entrepreneur. You're self-employed. Talk to us about those challenges.
Yeah, I think that the self-employed is the scariest part. I'm very comfortable explaining that I pay $1,600 a month for self-employed insurance for my family of 4, and it sucks, right? It is not good insurance. Like, it's not the type of insurance where it's just like, well, we might as well go to the doctor once a month because we're paying for it. It's like, literally, I'm paying that so that at the end of the year, if my kid breaks his arm, I only have to pay $20,000 more, not $50,000 more. And so God forbid that happens. That's just, there's no win there. And then, you got a budget and you got to have something to fall back on. Like, I'm here because of privilege, right? I acknowledge that fully. I learned ad tech not because I went to school to become someone technical, but because I asked my CTO at the time, who was overwhelmed, can I flight ads for you at the mobile media company I was at? And I look, and there's plenty of times where I've shut down people who've asked for that. And I'm reflecting on that and how awful that was and how I can change that. I think a lot of people have had these doors cut off to them. I think there were times in tech and ad tech and just industry in general where people were more open to teaching each other. And right now, I think that we've kind of regressed. Podcasting is 15 to 20 years old, depending on who you listen to, but the ad tech space is really only about 3 or 4 years old for heating up. I think that in ad tech and in business of podcasting, I think it's still easy to get into. I think the hardest part is being the creator on the mic and then trying to monetize it. Because in the same breath we say podcasting, we mean this podcast right here, and then we also mean a podcast that won an award at a Cannes Festival, right? We don't have that differentiation that video does, like the difference between YouTube and what's on HBO Max, and that's scary. It's too big of a gamut. My biggest thing is in this industry, you can keep creating, and you should keep creating if you're passionate about it, but don't let that be the only place that you work in the space. You can, Sean, who runs Fable and Folly, fantastic guy, has his own network. He's a big part of Pacific Content. That's his full-time job, right? And then he also runs Fable and Folly. That's cool. And I'm sure he's aiming for one time to transition over, or maybe not. Maybe there's so much value in being in both. And that's what I got to say is for people in the space who want to create, there's a lot of risk, but a lot of opportunity to do it while you're doing something else, or a lot of opportunity to take whatever you're doing in another field and apply to the podcasting field. Account management is just customer service. Sales is the same thing you're doing when you're waiting tables, right? There are junior jobs, there are entry-level jobs that you can justify and really show that you're passionate about. And I think that we can't sleep on that.
A great way to explain it, really, Bryan. It really is, because by definition, there is not much of a gap between an indie podcaster like myself and then somebody who might be for major media podcasting. I sound like my dad here telling the same stories over and over again, but back in the day when I started 15 years ago, it was solely really an indie sort of thing. But even now, by definition, there's not much of a difference. You're right. And another thing I've realized is monetizing and the advertising has really changed in a couple different ways. I'll explain one. When I started monetizing back in the day, you really had a need for a middleman, an agency, or whatever you want to call it. Cool thing now is that's basically, in a lot of ways, been eliminated. You can go straight to the source yourself. It's changed in some way. It's evolving.
Yeah, and that's something I talked about with a client earlier today was imagine being a writer for New York Times and getting huffy that an ad that you didn't like or didn't resonate with you was right next to your article in print or in digital, right? You have no say on that.
Right.
And in podcasting, we have more ownership. We're more of the creative control, which is really interesting and exciting, but it's got the detriment to it, right? You can be too picky and you got to determine, right? Is it your brand? Is it your morals? Or is it your paycheck? And sometimes you can't win on all of those. But the biggest thing I can say is that self-control, that direct control. I love that part. I love talking to people about sponsoring sounds profitable, helping me make it possible. I love doing consulting and selling my services that way. But I hate editing my podcast, so I pay somebody to do that. And in the exact opposite side, there are people who love creating and editing the podcast, and they should work with these other agencies. They should work with these rep firms for publishers or automated solutions like Voxnest and Podbean and Acast, things that you can plug into and just get revenue out of that are going to represent you, because those contracts aren't forever, right? Sign up for something. Let someone fill it full of ads that you don't like and learn what you don't like. Turn off everything you don't like and see if that revenue works for you, or figure out where you need to compromise on that end. And then if it gets to a point where they're selling out of your inventory completely and you keep growing and you're not making as much as you want, end the contract and do it directly, or start going direct and serving that inventory yourself before letting them backfill it. That's the advantage there. But I think sometimes we have some unreal expectations of what a podcaster could or should earn. Like, I love Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I got a pile of dice behind me there. I'd love to do an actual play podcast or Twitch stream or something like that. No one's going to pay another bald white dude to do that. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so we just got to be real with our expectation, right? If my wife told me today she wanted to start an Instagram brand, I wouldn't expect her to be able to make money for years off of it unless she hit on something that just blew up overnight. And, you know, we look at the revenue you can make from YouTube, right? You need millions of views before you're making anything substantial. And in podcasting, you could probably make more off of less engagement, but there's also less of an audience right now. So it's difficult. I don't envy people trying to make this their full-time thing, but I just recommend to them work in the space too. Do both. Learn, make connections. You might find a network that wants to take you on. You might find someone who wants to rep you. You might find someone who lacks the skills you have and wants to bring you in-house to help them grow their network or rep firm.
I'm going to take a minute here to tell you about a fine sponsor of this podcast, Indie Drop-In. If you're a true crime, paranormal, scary, or comedy podcaster looking to find new listeners, consider submitting an episode to be featured on Indie Drop-In shows. If your episode meets some minimum requirements, Indie Drop-In will play your episode to real listeners. The best part is, the listeners like your show, Indie Drop-In provides easy links for them to subscribe. It's 100% free. You get to drop your feed into a established feed that already has actual real listeners. This is great, guys. This is an amazing way to grow your audience. These listeners are already there. They listen to your episode on Indie Drop-In feed. They will go over and find your podcast and become a subscriber and love it. Greg, the creator of Indie Drop-In, just absolutely loves being involved in the independent podcast community. He is a great podcast mind. Make sure you give him a follow on Twitter at Indie Drop-In. But more importantly, go to indiedropin.com/creators. Get the submission going and submit an episode of your podcast into the Indie Drop-In feed. Hurry now. Get to it. You also can't underestimate the power of true engagement, right? Because it really does come down to, if you want to monetize, the value that you and your listeners have. This podcast, although I'm only a few months in, I've been able to secure, as of right now, I believe 3 sponsors. And that's not because I have 10,000 or 100,000 downloads every week. None of that's necessary. But my audience is valuable because the community is valuable. We're very engaged and very connected. That creates value. It's all about value.
Like if I were to calculate Sounds Profitable in a CPM range, remember I'm B2B. I'm a podcast and newsletter about podcast advertising technology and advertising and podcasting. I'm in the high hundreds to thousands of dollars CPM if you calculate it that way. You know what I mean? I don't report on those metrics. I'm covering specific topics that my sponsors want to be associated with. I'm offering a consulting hour as addition to that to talk to them about these topics. I'm reusing the content. I'm empowering them to put these in their sales decks and to use it to educate their clients. My podcast gets on average about 400, 500 downloads per episode, right? My newsletter is 3,500 subscribers with a 50% unique open rate, right? We're not talking a big audience when you talk about just general audiences. But for people who work in the podcast industry that are focused on learning and want to be engaged with podcast advertising technology, you know what I mean? I have that niche pretty well cornered. I would love for someone to come in and have a dissenting view on that. Every time someone talks about ad tech, I highlight them because I want more people to talk about it. That's the thing you got to realize. If it's just you and your friends talking about the movies you like, it might be real tough. But if you were a mechanic on a specific type of vehicle and it's been like widely used again and people need insight on it, like you're click and clack, but specifically for like a type of, I don't know, like a big truck, right? An 18-wheeler. You're in a situation where you can, like, you're getting a very specific target audience. I don't know. I think it's really important to remember that finding the right audience is the most important thing.
It can be confusing for people starting out. All these podcast hosting platforms advertise that they can help you monetize. It can really steer you in the wrong direction when you're starting.
I think the most important thing that people need to realize is that it doesn't matter what tool you're on, because the fun of open RSS is that you can transfer. Mm-hmm. The first podcast hosting platform you should be working on is one that fits all of your needs and makes you excited when you log into it, right? It doesn't need anything robust. It doesn't need ads in it. You building that relationship with the audience is what's important. And then you can move to wherever you want or use their tools, their more advanced tools. I mean, each of them offer something that is compelling for larger podcasters to stay on there. So I think building the audience is the most important part. And just remembering, like, there are tons of stocks I missed out on. There are tons of things in cryptocurrency, which I'm not a huge fan of, that I've missed out on, right? Like, don't worry about that revenue you didn't make in the first 6 months. Worry about the revenue you're going to make 6 months from now. Don't hold yourself back and force yourself to do everything. Think of it like going to the gym. Get consistent.
You always come across as a crypto guy to me. No, I'm just kidding, Bryan. We're talking about ad tech here. The tech doesn't always have the best rep. Kind of seems a little bit evil to some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think ad tech is the cockroach of industry. I mean, I love it because it's a tool. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people misrepresent it and use it poorly. I mean, we've seen like brand safety, for example, Microsoft and other companies blocking words blindly that defund the news, right? Blocking climate change, right? Just the words climate change, like, because they don't want to be associated with something like that. That's scary, right? That means NPR gets blocked on podcasts. That means, New York Times gets blocked on the news. Like that hurts journalism. But the tool there is really supposed to say, like, hey, you want to be alerted to when these words are used and a human should review it. But they skip that human part. They let the robots handle it. And that's the flaw, right? Yep. Someone built it to be used one way. Someone sells it to be used another way. The seller's always going to win. And that's why ad tech looks bad, right? Ad tech always looks like trying to get as much as possible. The technology isn't the malicious one. It's the person behind it. So that's the hard part there, because that's the risk and the fear and the message that we get taught about it. But I'm a big fan of it. I think and podcasting has such an opportunity to continue being so privacy focused. We only get IP address for targeting and podcasting, and IP address, if it's connected to your home Wi-Fi, which is like less than half your downloads at best, is then within 10 kilometers. That's the radius that they're allowed to be inaccurate on your geolocation. Sometimes they can take that IP and maybe, let's say, out of that 50% being the total pool, now we have half of that can be matched to your actual postal address. Well, I mean, we're looking at a fragment of this information, their information you already gave freely. You logged into Spotify, whose ads are not podcast ads. They're app ads in a podcast like content, right? That's something big to focus on. Spotify and Facebook serve ads in the same way, both in the same way. Podcasting serves it through building a file for you. But you tell Spotify, you tell Facebook your address, your name. You give them, every time you log in, you give them your IP addresses, right? Which they can resolve back to your postal address. You give them your email. You give them all these things. They connect it. They know your habits. They know what music you listen to. They know what things you engaged in or how fast you scrolled by something. Podcasting just knows that you requested a file. And like Megaphone as a hosting company can't take the data from all the different publishers and aggregate it together and build a profile about you. Only the individual publishers can do all that stuff. So we're looking at very little invasive and very little scary stuff on podcast ad tech, but it's easy to blow up the fact that IP addresses, personally identifiable information. It's a double-edged sword.
Let's go ahead and segue to this. I think podcast discoverability might be a little bit behind. Let's say you. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that Tom Webster is the guy to quote and focus on when it comes to discoverability. I mean, he said two things that really resonated with me. Like, it's the quality of your show and honing your craft, and then it's also the word of mouth is still so powerful. I mean,
absolutely.
You can buy ads, you can do all of that stuff, but what you really want is someone who loves your content sharing your content. Whatever that is, whatever it's someone else's newsletter, someone else's podcast, that organic growth is going to be way better. And so I don't know if we have a discoverability content problem. I mean, think about it like this, right? Podcasting right now feels like scrolling around on cable to find something to watch.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to hear that about word of mouth. That's something that everybody's going to say. But I guess what I'm kind of saying, Brian, is that the technology is there. It just doesn't seem like it's utilized the same way as it is for other things in relation to podcast discoverability.
Facebook recently reported that with the changes of losing mobile device ID, cookies, and being unable to see IP addresses for some Apple users on Safari, that they were underreporting conversions by about 15%, right? So people spending millions of dollars used to be able to just double how much they were spending and get double the results. And now it's only showing about a 30% increase in results because of tracking differences. Half of those companies are like spooked. And then the other half are just like, no, everything's like my number of sales doubles. It's just the attribution that's not there. So that's why in podcasting, a lot of what we do is modeling. We're saying, what was the baseline and what did this campaign do for growth over the baseline as modeled? We can't measure all of it, but of what we can measure, what does that say for the whole campaign success? And that's important to keep in mind there, that like just because we can't track everything one-to-one, just because when I say like, hey, check out the Sounds Profitable podcast, I can't measure every listener that then goes directly over there, doesn't mean they don't.
Well, ultimately, you have to measure with whatever tools that you do have.
Yeah, but it's not easy, right? Facebook has sold us on this world of put $1 in, get $5 out, and now they're clawing it back. And we just set unrealistic expectations. Your campaigns can be successful even if you can't measure everything.
Brian, let me ask you a sidebar question here. You mentioned Facebook. Well, Facebook getting into podcasting. Going back a few months, a lot of people in the podcast industry had a lot of big predictions and projections for the impact that Facebook would have in podcasting right now. Hasn't exactly panned out to those expectations yet. Why do you think that is?
I think that because it's easy to sensationalize expectations. Look at Apple, whose podcast app gets, lit on fire constantly, and they're the original podcast.
With not even the best user experience.
But, Tom, again, my hero, Tom Webster, who I'll quote all day long. Everybody should check out I Hear Things, his newsletter and podcast. I posed a question to him. I said, of the percent of the U.S. population that say they have yet to listen to podcasts, how high do they index with Facebook use? And turns out they index really high, right? So don't sleep on that. People who don't listen to podcasts use Facebook more than people who do. So your podcast being on there might be a great opportunity to get in front of more people. But you got to think about it. Every piece of content put on Facebook is a piece of information that Facebook can use to profile you, right? If I say Joe Rogan enough times in like Messenger or on my wall or whatnot, like Facebook could realistically identify me as a Joe Rogan supporter, an MMA fan, a podcast listener. And now that's a demographic I'm targeted in, and they can sell, right? So if podcasts go on there, that's more media consumption for them. If they have a reason to be able to keep the app open in the background when it's in your pocket, holy shit, the amount of data they can get from you. And then on top of that, say it sounds profitable and they don't want to advertise, like an advertiser doesn't want to advertise and sounds profitable. What's stopping them from advertising to everybody who listens to Sounds Profitable? Because now they know, right?
Yeah.
And think about it this way. Me and you are pretty heavy Twitter users. If I told you right now that you could listen to your podcast through the Twitter app and then leave comments in a Twitter thread under it, you'd switch over in a second.
Probably so, yes.
I think Facebook's phased out for a lot of us, but there's a bigger population that it seems to have not.
I see what you're saying there. The possibilities with Facebook are endless. And I think there's always the battle that people have if they want to go after people that have no knowledge of podcasting or they want to go after existing users. But in regards to Facebook, it's a lot easier to go after people on Facebook who have not heard of podcasting, because then they can actually listen to the podcast on Facebook. However, if you're going after people who already listen to podcasting, not on Facebook, it's going to be very hard to flip them and get them to go to a specific app like Facebook and listen to it. Telling somebody that already has a routine to change something up is never an easy task to pull off.
Yeah, it's why we love aggregators, right? Like, it's so goofy, but I can't wait for the world where I can open one app and see all of my subscriptions in it. Like, when we sit down last night, me and my wife were, we wanted to watch something on TV, and like I'm like looking for it, and she's like, it's not in Amazon Prime. It's in HBO Max. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, we've got 100 subscription services. It's all in these different ones, you know? And so that's the problem. The openness is, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. There's a billion podcast apps up there. But like, HBO Max just launched a Batman podcast in the HBO Max app. How you can't put it on like with the screen off in your pocket yet. Like, it's video only, but just audio, right? They got to update the app. But like, how killer is that? The second that Netflix starts doing season 3s of their canceled 2-season shows in podcast form, Disney Plus starts a Star Wars podcast, right? I'm in. You got me. I have those apps already. I have a kid. Second, I can put on a Muppets podcast because he loves watching the Muppet Babies. Like, you got me. I have to pay $2 extra a month. Done. I'm already paying you. What's $2 more? So I think that getting to people where they are is really attractive. People are in Spotify. It is so impressive how much of a holdout podcast or Apple Podcasts has, because the only thing you do in Apple Podcasts is Apple Podcasts. Audible having a podcast audience, Amazon Music, YouTube, Apple or Spotify, like, these are all services that do multiple things for us. So it's amazing the hold they're getting in podcasting, because they're now a Swiss Army knife. So I think it could go even further. HBO Max is going to be the first of a wave of new places to listen to podcasts.
I don't know what I'm more excited about, the Muppet Babies podcast or the Batman one, Brian. You talk about all these different things like HBO Max or Netflix getting into podcasting. Tons of possibilities there. But I think Apple's biggest thing is the integration piece, right? I mean, it always is going to win at the end of the day because it is integrated in the phone. You open it up and there it is. You don't need to download or do anything. There's been a lot of good advice in this episode so far. Let's keep it going a little bit here. Let me ask you something. So if a podcaster is just getting established, they feel comfortable with the amount of listeners they have, and they're starting to think about monetizing, what advice do you have, and what is the next step you take if you think you're ready?
I think figuring out how to do a one-sheeter on your podcast is really important. How do you quickly summarize in one page of a PDF who you are, why you matter, why people should be interested in you? Your download numbers, ideally from an IAB certified podcast host, is going to be really valuable for all the downloads in a 30-day period. None of this new episodes only stuff. The idea that your back catalog is worth anything less than the fact that someone downloaded it today. I don't care if you have 6 years of content. If someone listened to your first 6 episodes today, they're more valuable, in my opinion, than someone who listened to your most recent episode today. I would look at all downloads. I would portray that as much as possible. Chartable and Podsites are 2 companies that you can put a prefix URL on, right? So that's when the user presses play, it goes to them first, they get data. That'll give you demographic and behavioral insights into your audience. You can say they skew more male than female. They're more this age. They're more of this education bracket. Getting that and creating that one-sheeter is really powerful. There's tools like Podcorn and similar out there that I highly recommend. Gumball.fm is another one where you can list your inventory. A lot of them want you at like 5,000 or 10,000 downloads per month. And I don't think that's a bad place to start thinking about it. But remember that you're just putting yourself up there on offer and you're having this available. Treat it like developing a new habit, right? Like, any of you who say you floss every night, you're a liar. But if you try and do that and you try and develop that habit, you start small. You aim for a few times a week and then you try and increase from there and you grow. You need to just set up time. Say like once a week, I'm going to send out these mailers. Once a week, I'm going to check out Gumball and Podcorn. It's not something that more time necessarily means more money. And the worst part about it is the flow of everything. In September has been my busiest month because everybody's budgets are now reopening for next year. as well as they're planning out Q4, so October, November, and December, in like 15 days. So we're recording on the 30th of September. In like 15 days, mid-October, no one's going to respond back to me until like December 1st. And then after December 1st, like maybe December 15th, they'll talk to me. And then I won't hear from people again until January 1st, where the world's going to be on fire because there's always a dip Q1 in advertising. It just always happens, right? Budgets get paused. People don't necessarily keep the same spend they did from Q4 into Q1. There are people who have been my most adamant supporters, and there are people who promised that they wanted to work with me on stuff and collaborate that just go quiet for months and then pop back up excited and cut a big check or things like that. Like you got to just realize that there's so many aspects of it out of your control. And that's why I encourage so many of you to come work in this space. Work at an advertising agency, work at a publisher, work at a hosting platform or an ad tech company. We're dying for people who understand podcasting and have other skill sets. I mean, like, that's like a really important thing to highlight, that like, as you're growing this, more time doing it isn't necessarily going to get you results. It's like job hunting. Just because you job hunted for 40 hours a week doesn't mean you're going to be more successful at landing that job than if you just did 2 hours every day and didn't drive yourself nuts.
We kind of went in a little bit of a discussion the last bit about monetizing, but really the discussion at hand and a challenge a lot of people have is the advertising part. That can be a whole different beast from monetizing. Advertising can definitely be a challenge.
To like grow your subscribers, yeah, that can be real tough, right? You know, episode drops are things that some hosting platforms do within them. Like I think Red Circle and now Captivate will allow you in the platform to do like episode drop swaps, like promos for your own show on other podcasts and vice versa. Finding similar podcasts and doing that yourself, it's a lot of work, right? It's hard to measure.
Please note, you said similar podcast.
Yeah. I mean, like Sounds Profitable is a really hard podcast to do an episode drop on, right? Like, if anybody thinks that their podcast audience resonates with people who want to learn about podcast advertising technology on the industry level, or people striving to be at the industry level, like, hit me up. We'll talk about an episode drop. I'll pay you for it. That's the hard part. A lot of that stuff, a lot of that growth is why networks exist, right? You're part of a network and it just becomes a given that you promo each other. You know, the advertising dollars, they market the network, and by marketing the network, they also throw in promos specifically for you. It's a lot. Just be honest with yourself about what your skill is. Like, just because you started a podcast doesn't mean you're magically a salesperson and a marketer. Give yourself some credit and realize that if somebody said to you, hey, I want to start my own food truck, but I have no money or recipes, you'd laugh at them. Treat this like a business. Treat this like opening a restaurant or a store or something like that, where they tell you it could be several years before you break even, or you need $100,000 to invest in it. Like, there is a difference between coffee money, date night money, car payment money, and mortgage money. And just figure out what you're happy with and make sure you don't dive into a part of it that just makes you burn out.
I think some of the burnout comes because people don't know where to focus. There's so many things to worry about. Ultimately, though, you must realize that you have to worry about your content.
Yeah, and make it available as much as possible. Don't put too much behind subscriptions or anything like that. Treat subscriptions as ways for people to tip you. Do behind the scenes stuff there. Do early releases maybe, but don't punish people who don't want to pay for you. And remember, a great example is like some of the people who are killing it on subscriptions are now dropping on the rankings on Apple Podcasts because their subscriptions are doing so well that people aren't listening to the free feed. So now they're less visible, right? That's something you got to keep in mind. And transcribe it and have your own website and make that content searchable and make little clips of it and make little tweets related to it and LinkedIn posts and whatever that fits. Reuse that content. Expand on it with other articles. You should see the things that people come to Sounds Profitable from searching on Google that I'm just the only one covering. And so I'm at the top of the list.
I'm glad you brought up website because this is a very emotional thing with me, and I'll explain why. Yesterday, I was in a Twitter space where it was some podcasting advice was being passed around. There was this podcaster who was asking for advice. He had been doing his podcast for a while, was trying to figure out how to become more searchable. And I kid you not, this guy told him it was not important to have a website. I about shit my pants. Then he went on about a link tree. I agree, link trees are convenient to share, but you need a website. I know you're not going to disagree with that, but share your thoughts here.
I think whatever service you want to use, as long as it resolves to a domain name you own.
Exactly.
And you have access to export that content, that's fine, but Linktree is not the right answer. And please have an email address that resolves at that domain. It's like $5 or $6 a month. If you are in a situation where you can't pay for that domain, you can't pay for hosting, you can't pay for the email, you're not ready for advertising. And it's okay. You don't have to be. That is an option. You can just have fun with this. You can see what you serendipitously fall into, right? You could be talking to someone at a local coffee shop and they have a local business and it's just a great fit and you run an ad for them because your podcast resonates with that local audience. But if you want to treat it like a business, you gotta appear like a business. And for some of us, this is our first step into the business side, especially as a sole proprietor.
Final thoughts here. How do you feel your podcasting skills are compared to your amazing killer newsletter skills?
I'm not a good podcaster. I love rambling. Like, the fact that you didn't send me over questions was so exciting for me because I get to just get it off the top of my head, and that's so exciting. I love collaborating and interacting with people. It's a level of stress I've never had before. But when I get to hear it or when people make comments about it, it's really exciting. I enjoy it, but I think it takes more out of me than the newsletter. I think that if I could hole up with my articles and just write about it, it's great. But I think that the passion that I bring to the table by talking about these things, even narrating my own articles, I'll never do like the AI narration for the English ones because I'm so focused on people hearing how excited I am about this, because I am. I live and breathe all of this. So yeah, I don't know. At the end of the day, I'm very happy that I do it, but it is probably the most time-consuming part of my job. And I record and then send over the files to my amazing editor, Ian Powell, and him and Evo Terra make magic out of it and put it live. And I just get to listen to it when it comes out.
Look at you dropping some names there, huh? Yeah, I mean, all people that are resources for the podcasting community. Bryan, to be honest with you, to me, though, the fact that you are a podcaster made me want to read your newsletter that much more. Makes you relatable, man.
Yeah, I think that if I'm going to talk about how to apply these things, I have to have experienced it firsthand. When I worked at Megaphone, when I worked at Barometric and Claritas, I never had a podcast, so I didn't grasp how to set all that stuff up. I had done it one-off, but I hadn't done it on something I owned. I hadn't built my process around it. I hadn't seen the user side other than demo or a quick walkthrough of it. The goal is to make it relatable and show people like, hey, I am self-employed and I did all of this. Right? You can do this too. If I can afford to have transcripts on all my podcasts, you can do it on your podcast too, big company. And you should, for accessibility and reach, and just to make sure we're inviting everybody we want into the space.
I tell you what, I could talk podcasting all day and all night. And I appreciate you sharing all this great information with the listeners in the podcasting community. But I do want to give you a second here to tell people about where they can find all this awesome stuff that you're doing, man.
So soundsprofitable.com will get you to the newsletter, to the Podscape, which is kind of like an overview we did of the entire industry and all the companies involved in it. Working on an audio version coming out soon, which I'm really excited about. It links to the podcast as well. I'd love for you to subscribe to it. I mean, it is geared towards people in the industry. The cool part about it is it's geared toward people who want to be there too, right? Who want to learn about this, who are building a business and building their podcast to be at that level. And so everything I write about can be applied or can help you in the negotiations when an advertiser or an agency comes to ask you a question. But I'm working as hard as I can to educate as many people as possible and include as many people as possible. So keep your eyes peeled for some, hopefully, training and certification, things like that. And I will continue to, as always, provide everything I do for free to the people who are learning from it, because the people who are learning this are the last people whose money I want. I want the companies who want to empower people in the space to come pay and sponsor all of this. And I never want to block any content.
Again, I appreciate your time. Everybody go check out all the awesome stuff Bryan's involved in. Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you.
Really do appreciate you listening to this episode and checking it out. I hope you continue to do so with the next. I hope you have an appreciation for what I'm trying to do here. Highlight all the different things all sorts of different creators are doing. I hope you get behind me on that and continue to join me on my journey. I'm Podcast Father, the Indie Podcaster. See you next time.